Perhaps it's worth saying how I got to this maybe rather nerdy niche interest of mine. And it really began in 2013 when I was worshipping in Edinburgh. And the four Methodist churches in the city centre of Edinburgh combined to form a new church. And between the four churches, we were able to identify 9 different fonts. And my first thought was, well, this is quite extraordinary. And my second thought was, all these fonts are very different. Some are freestanding, quite modern, others are very old looking, and I wanted to find out more. So just to avoid any confusion, it's worth saying that, of course, we are talking about the kind of font that derives from the Latin noun for a source or fountain, fons fontis, a vessel which holds the baptismal water, rather than a typeface, because quite often when I say to people I'm researching Methodist fonts, they think I'm talking about something that you might choose when you're writing a Word document, but of course that's not the case. And it's just interesting that that comes from the Latin verb to found or cast metal, fondere, the word font as in typeface. Anyway, I'm sure you're well aware of all that already. So it's worth just starting, I think, with baptism in Wesley's time, because that is an important context for understanding the interesting collection of fonts in the museum at Anglesey Brook and elsewhere around the connection. And in John Wesley's time, he was prepared to baptize infants or adults. He took his views partly from his own father's writing on baptism, which were based on the Book of Common Prayer. He was a great advocate for immersion of babies, as maybe also of adults, but certainly there was a preference for him, at least in the beginning of his ministry, to use the full-size immersion font and dunk the babies, as one might say. He was insistent that an Anglican clergyman was the only person who could perform a genuine baptism, at least in our own country. And he was prepared to use a range of venues. So with some adult baptisms, Nathaniel Gilbert from Antigua, for example, was not baptized in a church, as we understand, but in somebody's home. But of course, Wesley had a long life, and people didn't always want to do things his way. And so there were certain practices that were developing and changing during the course of his life and ministry. First of all, there was a growing preference for pouring or sprinkling water in baptism in all sorts of denominations. There was an issue for Wesley when he was in America about a family who wanted their child to be baptized by pouring the water rather than immersion, which he refused to do, and they promptly went off and found someone else who would do it the way they wanted. But also pouring and sprinkling water from using a bowl had become more common in the Commonwealth era, when the fonts tended to go out of use. So it was something that folk were aware of. And as we were perhaps saying earlier in the chat, you know, if the water was left in the big medieval font from week to week and month to month, you can understand why parents might not want their children dunked in it. Now, Wesley did allow some of his itinerants who served in Scotland to perform baptisms. And increasingly at the end of his life, there were recorded instances of itinerants and lay Methodists baptizing in England in Methodist chapels. And this came to the attention of certain parish vicars who wrote, or rectors, who wrote to complain to Mr. Wesley that his itinerants were baptizing. And Wesley always replied to say, I have expressly forbid them to do it, and I've told them not to do it again. But it's actually evident from certain baptismal records that rule was not always adhered to. The earliest baptismal records are from Mount Zion Church in Ovenden near Halifax, and they date from the late 1770s, well before Wesley died. So we have records of baptisms that were definitely performed in Methodist churches before his death. But it's fair to say that until the mid-1800s, most baptisms were in the parish church. And this was the preference and perhaps the practice that was continued for some time and died out and transferred to Methodist churches over an extended period of time. After Wesley's death, you'll be aware that there were a certain amount of disagreement about how to take things forward. And in the plan of pacification, there were plans set out for the proper conduct of the sacraments of Holy Communion and baptism. And so we do find that baptism records become more common after about 1795. It's always been the case that very ill infants could be baptized at home when, of course, they wouldn't be immersed. They were more likely to have water sprinkled on them. And that continued. There was a settlement in 1842 of the Privy Council dealing with the confusion over burial rites in this place called Gedney in Lincolnshire, which was a Wesleyan challenge to the Privy Council. What happened was a child had had a Methodist baptism, died, and the Anglican clergyman refused to bury the child in the churchyard because he said the child hadn't had a proper baptism. So the Wesleyans took this case all the way to the Privy Council, and the ruling was in their favour in 1842. And I think that last worry that if you had your child baptised in a Methodist setting, they might not be able to get buried in the parish church or parish churchyard was overcome by that time. So to come to baptism in the Primitive Methodist Church, Hugh Bourne wrote a really fascinating treatise. I'm probably telling you things you know already. I feel very self-conscious about that, but I found it an interesting read in preparing for this. And in particular, you can trace changing attitudes towards baptism, I think, from the Hugh Bourne's treatise in 1823 right up to the period at the beginning of the First World War. Treatise isn't very long, and it's in sort of question and answer format between parents and the minister. And it has, to my mind, three main themes. In the first theme, he sets out the full biblical context for understanding baptism, from the parting of the Red Sea right through the Old into the New Testament. The second interesting thing he says, which I haven't really heard expressed elsewhere, is a preference or an upholding and an encouragement to baptize infants. One of the reasons he says this is that a baptism of a child can never be done for outward show or appearances, at least as far as the baptized child is concerned. Whereas an adult baptism might be just someone doing it as a performance. So that's an interesting thought. And the second one, the third point he makes is that the understanding, the spiritual direction of parents and their sort of status as Christians was not of primary importance, because he says the whole church has a role to pray as guardian parents for baptized infants. And I think that's a really interesting thought of this guardian parentship. So I've had a little look in our Oxfordshire Record Office for the earliest baptismal records from the Primitive Methodist circuits. And in Oxfordshire, they date from the 1830s. Farringdon 1834, Banbury Circuit 1837, and the Oxford Primitive Circuit 1839. I haven't delved into record offices from around the country, but I don't expect that's particularly unusual. One reason why this might have been the case, of course, is to do with infant mortality and perhaps the prevalence of cholera outbreaks at that time. And it is interesting when you look at baptismal records, you can now Google to find out what day of the week that date was, that quite often the baptisms were not being performed on a Sunday. So it may well be the case that these were baptisms done in the home of children who you were concerned about their health. And indeed, some of the ceramic manufacturers like Worcester and Minton started to create little pocket fonts with their own carry cases in the 1830s for use in extremis like that.
Mm-hmm.
As you moved towards the latter part of the 19th century, the order of service such as there is for baptism in the Primitive Methodist Church, and there are those, has a much greater emphasis on the nature of the baptism as a dedication of the child and an opportunity for the parents to make promises about bringing up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, using the words that were in the prayer book. So the emphasis shifts to a family context of Christian upbringing, perhaps mapping onto the Victorian understanding of childhood, Queen Victoria and her family. I'm sure you've examined this in other aspects in your study of childhood in Primitive Methodism. By the beginning of the 20th century, it's quite evident that some baptisms were many baptisms were being performed, but some were being performed in a way that caused concern among some of the clergy. So in 1909, Arthur Fawcett wrote in the Primitive Methodist magazine, "There are comparatively few of our sanctuaries furnished with a proper baptismal font. A common basin, not infrequently placed on a seat or chair, serves the purpose. The ordinary vessel bespeaks the small importance attached to the ceremony." I think this is such a fascinating comment. So first of all, he's saying that there isn't a proper font in most chapels. It's just an ordinary bowl. It isn't even put on a prominent place like the communion table or on its own stand. You just pull up a chair or a seat and plonk it on there. And such an interesting reflection, the ordinary vessel bespeaks the small importance attached to the ceremony. Well, don't know whether I actually agree with that, but that's the way he felt. And there are others who write at the same time about the not always being the itinerant minister or preacher not always being informed in advance that the baptism was to take place. The form of words wasn't ready. And I don't know the full context of this, but one suspicion I have is the fact that in the Baptist church at the time, baptism of adults in public rivers were a great public event. You see amazing photographs in newspapers from the time. There's one from Charlbury in Oxfordshire of this extraordinary charabanc with all these young adults in white dresses, big Edwardian hats, white suits, being taken down the river for their public baptism in the Baptist church. And this was grabbing the headlines. And I just wonder whether Arthur Fawcett felt that Primitive Methodist baptisms didn't quite cut the mustard. Well, let's go on to look at some of the fonts that were used for baptisms in Primitive Methodist churches. Here are a collection of them at Anglesey Brook Museum. And the first thing to say is there's no plain bowl here, no common bowl or basin, which is an interesting reflection on our collection policies, isn't it? So these are probably not typical, but with the exception of one of your fonts in this image, they're not unique. We find them across Primitive Methodist, Wesleyan, and United Methodist churches. Each of these types I've seen elsewhere. And I'm going to spend a little time looking at some of them in detail and asking where they've come from, because when I first saw fonts like this in Methodist churches, I really was quite surprised. First of all, let's look at, I'll just go back. We're looking at the top shelf here, two identical fonts, one, the second from the left, and then the next one along, which is on a little wooden stand, and its lid has been taken off, presumably because it won't fit on the shelf, but they are actually identical fonts. And here's an image of another one, the one on the left of this screen. This is actually the original font from Wesley Memorial in Oxford, which moved on to Kennington Church. And you can see it's in a sort of goblet form of a medieval style. And it is based on an original, which is the photograph on the right of the screen. This is the 700-year-old font in St. Mary Magdalene Church in Oxford, just south of the Martyrs Memorial. Still in use as a font. And if you compare the two, just ignoring the lid on the tabletop font for a start, you can see it's very similar. In fact, the original font is so eroded that you almost get a better view of what that font might have looked like when it was new by looking at its miniaturized form. Why were Methodist churches, Primitive, Wesleyan and others, acquiring these miniaturized version of Anglican, or you might even say Catholic, originally Catholic fonts? Well, I think it's all to do with the move towards accepting Gothic as being churchy, relevant in the later 19th century, in response to, as Arthur Fawcett said, you know, the ordinary vessel bespeaks the small importance of the ceremony. The Oxford movement, of course, was growing up in the middle of the 19th century, influencing that, and its sister organisation, the Cambridge Camden Society, actually commissioned modelers to create miniature versions of medieval fonts as study items for their members. So they were acquired, maybe you maybe have parts of a Greek statue miniaturized on your mantelpiece. You might, in your study, you might also have a miniature font. This was one of them, and there were others from St Mary Nottingham and others which I'll mention later. So they were actually created as study items. But at some point, the big ceramic manufacturers in the potteries caught on to the idea that people might like these as ornaments, but then eventually churches, particularly Methodist ones, might well acquire them for use in a sacramental setting. So a little domed lid is a confection. The lid itself is the lid on the medieval font is just a flat wooden font lid. The reason you can't see it because of the angle of my photograph. But these were manufactured by Minton from the 1860s. You see them in their catalogues, and they continue to manufacture them over a period of time. This one has a cartouche on the bottom saying that it's Minton. Others don't. They may well be copies in the same style. Sometimes they are glazed, sometimes they're in Parian ware. They do vary. Often they get broken, and it's usually the lid that gets broken. And in fact, there is a repair on the finial, just below the zigzag finial. There's a repair on this one. Interesting that in one example at Engels book, it's been given a little stand to make it look a little bit bigger. I find that fascinating. Now we move on to the next font, which was also on the top row, and this is very different. It's of a square font style with its central circular shaft and then 4 shafts around. You can see that it's got presentation details on it. Now, Brindley Ford Methodist Chapel was the first building was erected in 1862. So this could have been presented at that time. I've tried to find a Miss M. Worley, but I've not had much luck. Actually, I think maybe I was looking for an H. Worley. Maybe that's a mistake. I was all over Ancestry trying to find out when she might have died, but I've not been able to do that. The baptismal register for this chapel does date from 1863. This is a font made as a miniaturized item by Copeland, and they made them in this white Parian ware, but they also made them in black. And the reason they made them in black is that this is based on the original font in Winchester Cathedral. Here it is. Here's the Winchester Cathedral, 12th century black basalt font made in Tournai in Belgium. It's got engraved scenes around it. Don't worry if you can't see those, because I'm going to give you a close-up in a moment. I'm sorry the photograph is not great. I had to take this off the internet because I did go to Winchester for Palm Sunday weekend, partly for the fun of it, but also to take a photograph of the font. But it's leaking and they're having to do extensive repairs, so it's all covered in boarding, so I couldn't get a photograph. Let's do a close-up of one side of the original font, which is on the top, and the same side of your font underneath. And here we have one of the 2 scenes from the life of St. Nicholas. Here he is with his Bishop's Palace on the top, and St. Nicholas is on the right with his crozier, handing the money to the father kneeling gratefully for the money he's giving them to pass on to the 3 daughters who are on his right, so that the 3rd daughter, who's second from the left, can marry the guy on the left who is her fiance. So it's telling the whole story. Nicholas is given the money, and the money's being passed along so that she can get married. What's quite interesting is if you compare this with the detail in the Copeland font, the Bishop's Palace has sort of been reduced down to more of a Primitive Methodist Chapel than the detail that you see in the original. Now, this font, which was also on the top shelf, is perhaps the most prevalent kind of font you see around the connection. It's made of alabaster. It's again a tabletop form, and I'm really only talking about the tabletop fonts in the collection because I know there aren't very many freestanding ones. This one was presented to the Methodist Church at Westbourne Street by the members of the Women's Own. Isn't that nice? And as you can see, looking at the font on the right, it's based on originals. You can get fonts like the one on the left with central shaft like this, with a little foot so that the bowl is quite close to the table, or actually with no bowl at all. Sometimes, no foot at all, sorry. Sometimes they're circular, sometimes they're octagonal, sometimes they're different colours, and sometimes they're made not of alabaster, but of serpentine, Cornish serpentine. And sometimes they're very small, only maybe 14 centimetres tall. And it's questionable whether they were actually made as ornaments or whether, in fact, they may have been used for home baptisms, but they really held very little water at all. Anybody know where the font on the right is to be found? Well, it's not a very good photograph, but that's the font at Wesley's Chapel. It's not entirely made of alabaster, but it's got an alabaster plinth and an alabaster bowl, rim on the bowl, but the bowl itself is the bowl from the medieval font from John Fletcher's parish church in Madeley. It was a gift, a late 19th century gift. So you do get full-size floor-standing alabaster fonts, but they are hugely subject to leaking, as are the little ones. They can easily get cracks in them. And I've seen these all over the connection. Now, here's an unusual one. This font is in Castleford creamware. It was presented to Stanton Hill Primitive Methodist Church in Nottinghamshire in 1915. And you can see it's been designed as a font. It's got the cross and the lettering on it. And it's basically a bowl with a foot, but the bowl is in the form of 4 lobes. And I've never seen another font like this anywhere. And I spent some time trying to work out why it was this shape, but it is, looking from the top, vaguely cruciform in shape. And in the course of preparing to do a local arrangement at my own church about fonts, I looked into the history of baptism in the first few centuries after Christ. And of course, baptism at the time would have been performed in the water, and baptistries were created, they still exist all over the Roman world. St. John Lateran, for example. But in many cases in Rome and in the Holy Land, those baptistries have been rebuilt over the years, so you can't see what they would originally have been like. However, in North Africa, in Tunisia, certain baptistries have been excavated and removed to museums, and you get this fascinating baptistry from Kilibia. I think it's 6th century maybe, or 7th century, with these amazing mosaics. But the thing to look at really here is the shape. And you can see how I've made connections between the shape of this Castleford creamware font, which you can fill just the water in the central section, or if you want to use copious quantities of water, you can fill it right up to the rim. But it's very similar to this cruciform shape, which you can step down and engage in the symbolism of life and death, living and rising, and water, those very potent symbols of baptism. Now, from the very large to the very small, the one in your collection is the top left photograph. And it's also made by Minton. And you rarely, but I have seen these with their own stand. In fact, I think John Anderson's got one. It's got a similar lid to the one that was on the Mary Magdalene font. In fact, the bottom photograph is the font picture I showed you earlier with that zigzag finial. And this is really based on a kind of domestic item. The main photograph is of a muffin dish. And the person who wrote the definitive book about, and he calls them miniature baptismal fonts, calls this style of font a muffin dish font. I just mentioned that book. It's called Miniature Baptismal Fonts. It's by someone called Julian Wheeler. He's done an awful lot of research, but he knew nothing about Methodism. And so the context of his book is that miniature fonts were used inside parish church fonts when they became anxious about using the medieval lead line font, or they were used for private baptisms. And he's published a beautiful book to that effect. But he and I are good friends now, and he keeps complaining that he's going to have to produce a second edition because of all these miniature or tabletop fonts I send him pictures of from around the country. And what about this lovely one? This is an extraordinary, more Gothic than Gothic font, and I've not been able to find an original font or even inspiration for this font really anywhere, although any chantry chapel of late 14th, 15th century style may have this sort of architectural detail, or indeed choir. You know, the style is very much there, but as a font, I haven't seen it in original form. You'll see that I'm comparing it with a grey version on the right. And this is on the website of the Ridgway Pattern Book. So this is almost certainly made by E.J. Ridgway and Abington, a Hanley firm, or it's a copy of one of theirs. They were manufacturing with that name from 1835 to 1860. Now, unlike the example on the right, yours doesn't seem to have the right maker's mark on it. So it could be a copy of that sort of style. In the catalogue, it's listed as a Gothic vase. But clearly it's in your collection as having been used as a font. And there are others that are still in use as a font. One is in, I think it's St. John's Methodist Church in the Isle of Man. One is in Marsh Methodist Church, Oxon Hope in Yorkshire, which was identified for me by Joanne Barmforth, Conservation Officer. And there was another one like this in Newbiggin in Teesdale, a very old Wesleyan chapel, which closed about 10 years ago. And I think the font has gone to the Faith Museum at Bishop Auckland. So they're obviously used as fonts, even if the manufacturer thought that they were making Gothic vases. But to come back to commemorative and more simple forms, on the left we have the font that's in your collection, which I think is a commemorative font of Primitive Methodism. I don't know whether it dates to the centenary, I didn't check the date. Hugh Bourne's face is on the other side, picture of Mowcop, and suffer the little children to come unto me, the very common phrase used in Baptist settings. Although, I must just interject, in my parents' Methodist chapel, the table just says, suffer little children. No.
Well, we do, we have.
Which is a bit unfortunate. Anyway, I'm digressing. I'm comparing this font with the image on the right, which is a piece of Wesleyan centenary ware from the 1838-39 centenary, which has a picture of Wesley on the other side. And here a verse from a Charles Wesley hymn about childhood. Actually, I think it's a hymn that was really written for a funeral. But anyway, that's by the by. You can see that a bowl, which would hold substantially more water, may well have been used in many settings. And at least this one in your collection has something dignified about it, having a little stand. But it was made for commemorative purposes. We don't know whether, it probably was used somewhere, but I don't know from your own modes record where it came from. I'm sorry, I couldn't identify that one. And then I think this is the penultimate collection of fonts I was going to show you. This is the one from the chapel itself, a token of esteem from members and friends of the scholars of Anglesey Brook in memory of the late Mrs. Mary Proctor, who I believe died in 1910, if I've identified the right lady. That would be correct in terms of the style here of this alabaster font. And I don't know the exact dimensions of it, Ruth, but I imagine it's maybe even up to maybe even a couple of feet tall, maybe 18 inches, 18, 20 inches. So quite substantially sized. And then we get on to what I call the wood, the weird and the wonderful. On the left, you've got a wooden font marked in memory of Beatrice and Whittingham, sort of vaguely styled on a floor standing font, but showing, as many wooden fonts do, the problem of using wood and water together. You get staining and things deteriorate, and you definitely need something to line the, to form the vessel that will hold the water. The central font was made by somebody called E. Morris in 1991, but the chapel had, at Melverley had formerly been a Primitive Methodist Chapel. And then one of your more recent acquisitions on the right, sorry about this, this is the font from Enderby Methodist Chapel in Leicestershire, which was a Primitive Methodist font. It dates from 1930 and it's quite extraordinary, I think you would agree. It's sort of in the kind of cremation urn category of fonts, but it's really large. It's about 24, it's nearly 2 foot tall. The lid lifts off, it's got a small bowl inside. And I think what these fonts demonstrate to me is that the wood turner's art and those who wanted to make something for the church, well, this is maybe a bit unfair, but it wasn't ever policed. You know, somebody made something and it was just what was made, and so one accepted it graciously, and that was that. I'm sorry if this is your favorite form of font. You can tell that it isn't exactly mine. But they are amazing and indicative of a huge range of fonts. And indeed, many fonts in Methodist churches will have a wooden stand, those that are freestanding. So here are all the different styles of fonts that we've talked about and the reasons for them. We've got a craze for the Gothic, symbolic fonts of a particular shape, things that have got a more domestic setting, a muffin dish or a plain bowl, those that are commemorative about a particular event or a person, something that's been commissioned or someone has said, I'll do you a font, often revealing the woodworker's gift. But actually, of course, baptism's all about the water. And as long as baptism is performed with water and in the name of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, it's a genuine baptism. And that was actually the ruling of the Privy Council in a case, in the Gedney case that I mentioned earlier, where there was a dispute over whether a child could be buried in the churchyard. The decision was to do with the fact that it had been about water, and water had been used and the name of the Trinity had been invoked. However, although it's all about the water, this phrase from 1909 is picked up much later, that the ordinary vessel bespeaks the small importance of the ceremony. That feeling is picked up in the textbook that's now used for baptism at Queen's. And the result of this is that you will find that many Methodist ministers who've been trained at Queen's more recently have a marked preference for a baptismal font that holds a lot of water. And part of it is the quote here below. If we picture the threefold symbolism of water in baptism, pointing to birth and life, to death and drowning, and to washing and bathing, then each of these involves more than a few drops of water available from a sugar bowl font. What an interesting and somewhat derogatory phrase, a sugar bowl font. So this puts the fate of the font in some question, especially those which hold very little water. But there's another push that is putting the font into questionable future territory, and that is that Those who are coming forward for baptism today may well be adults, young adults, and increasingly they are looking for a baptism that involves a great deal more water than any font will hold, and they're looking for immersion experiences. And as Methodist churches, we're being caught on the back foot and have to improvise or install temporary pools. And this is something that was actually referred to in some of the commentaries in the Primitive Methodist magazine. Perhaps we need to think about allowing adults to be baptized by immersion. Very interesting thought. So we come to the end very shortly and just ask, what is the fate of the font? Well, my feeling is that there will always be parents who want to bring their child for baptism and will be very happy for the font that is in the church to be used, whether the minister has actually got a preference for a larger bowl or not. So I hope the first fate for the font is that it will be used in baptism. The second is that I hope that if anything results out of this rather nerdy and weird research project that I've engaged in, is that baptismal fonts will become more visible in churches. Because it's so easy for them to get broken, very often smaller tabletop fonts are put away in cupboards, in the vestry, under a table, under a chair, between baptisms. And of course, it's sadly the case that there aren't as many infant baptisms these days in our churches as there used to be. So often they're not there. And we gaily sing, "Here our table, font and pulpit," and there ain't no font to be seen, but it's probably in the church somewhere. So I would hope that they would become more visible. Of course, there is the agonizing decision of what to do if a chapel closes. We will have this in our own circuit. And it's important that they are thoughtfully passed on. There is some guidance now on the Methodist Church about what to do with your stuff when your chapel, or if and when your chapel closes. They may be passed to a museum, they may be passed to another church. It may be appropriate for them to be passed to a church family whose children and generations have been baptized in that font. They can't all be saved. Some of them are in very poor condition, especially the wooden ones, and it's maybe not worth it, but they need to be thoughtfully passed on, and when they are, the record of what's happened to that font should be recorded in some minute somewhere, whether it's the church council or the circuit meeting. But I think there's possibly also a more symbolic role for a font if and when immersion baptism becomes more popular. And the reason for that is that baptisms are still relatively rare. And it's not that common to hear a sermon preached about baptism when a baptism isn't happening. It's obvious to do it when the baptism is happening. And in the Anglican calendar year, there's often a service around the theme of baptism just about when we're doing covenant or at Easter. We tend not to hear many sermons, or at least that's my experience, about baptism. And your small tabletop font is the most wonderful visual aid. In fact, I might even be so bold as to say, perhaps we should take up the increasing Anglican, at least cathedral tradition of offering an Epiphany service in which you're given the opportunity to renew your baptismal vows. And you are asperged, you are sprinkled with the water from the font. I went to one of those in Norwich Cathedral last year and it was really rather meaningful. But another point of the font is that, you know, let's face it, a paddling pool used as a font is not a beautiful thing. And it's not there all the time. Even a baptistry in a church is covered over. But the sight of the font gives substance to a mystery that I don't think any of us really understand. I think because of and I really approve and understand the theory of the baptism of infants, all this for you before you can ever understand it, is so important that baptism of a child in a font which you can see reminds us all of our utter dependence on God, whatever our skills or lack of them, and whoever we are, we're all accepted from the earliest instance of our conception and right through to the end of time. Well, that's all I have to say. I've got some time for questions. I'm sorry, I slightly overrun. If you wanted to send me any font pictures, you can either use the email address you have for me already, or use this one, which you can find easily enough on the Wesley Memorial website or rapidly write down. But for now, thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.